Yeah, so what I will do is talk about something very different, but perhaps we later can make a connection to the digital reality. What I foremost talk about is, as you see, the power of gentleness in architecture towards an aesthetics of hospitality is more about what you could say, and I also asked to Yuri the complicated question, of course, what kind of other culture could we produce in our contemporary reality to resist it or transform it from within? So let's start. So great to be back at this second conference already, and I think it's a fantastic tradition that are regularly those conferences which make us think to write papers about this very important transformations we see in our reality, our digital reality, and how we could relate to that, or how we could innovate that reality with it or against it. So as I already said, I have a new kind of preoccupation, trying it out, which is called the power of gentleness. And according to me, that has everything to do with freedom and how that can be created within constraints, or in other words, how you can dance with enmeshment, can move beyond limiting adversary, and dare to create lives of sustained optimal well-being and joy. Differently put, its research wishes to address how a possible horizon of emancipation can be constructed with the support of architecture. It's about a micropolitics of change, a research exploring what the plausible relation between form, and in Yuri terms also between the image, imagination, and sociality can be, how architecture can help to withstand the many crises of today, and only plays a small part in that, but how can we do that? And according to me, the power of gentleness is timely for architecture and needs to be further explored. Because to me, gentleness reaches beyond what a politics of care or repair can sustain. For many, care is the all-encompassing emancipatory framework for any cultural, scientific, or social work today, and also rightly so. More than ever, we are in need of public institutions of care, which are now too weak, destroyed, or worse, absent or falling apart, etc., etc. The neoliberal regime of privatization and deregulation supported a competitive market which is profit-based and considers care as low value in the current economy because it is unproductive and costs too much money. But with our fight for public institution of care, we also have to be aware that our relation to institutions of care, architecture included, is rather contradictory. So it's very important to invest in care, but there is also a risk to care. And we know that, of course, with the arrival of modern institutes and modern architecture, that those institutions of care turned us also impatient, and in that sense made us sick, even if we feel that we are healthy and full of energy. So in other words, there you could say there is a blind spot in the current politics of care. Care can slip quickly into paternalism and control, and is in addressing emergencies often solving anything else. So the last decades, this discourse of sustainability, of care, can be characterized by a move away from the architectural object towards a focus on the processes through which the architectural object is materialized, produced, constructed, maintained, demolished, recycled, renovated, you name it, co-produced with the community, etc., etc. Reconsidering architecture from these relational perspectives of social and ecological care is of extreme and urgent importance given the many crises we are seeing today and the many refugees, etc., etc. But unfortunately, the question of aesthetics, the distribution of our senses through architecture syntax and form, how content is always mediated by a form, has disappeared by reducing architecture to a byproduct of processes, materials, and technologies. By neglecting the question of aesthetics and its political effects, its value systems, it is underestimated how essential the visual, experiential, haptic and bodily engagement of an aesthetic regime is for its users, architects and alike. How aesthetics, in fact, can help to develop, bring a much imaginative power towards another future. So, as mentioned, cultural practices are today engaged in providing care for others. But should the arts be limited to become an orthopedic aesthetics, as Grant Kester remarked, become engaged in just a reparative turn? To me, care needs our scrutiny more than ever, but the arts capacities, architecture included, to project, resist, to alter, to create happiness, joy, and imagine otherwise should not be seen in opposition. Instead of a binary choice, the duty of care or the arts, I propose a third way, and that is what I call the power of gentleness. No thinker, except Anne du Fourmentel, a French philosopher, has ever really considered the question of gentleness thematically. We see it in philosophy. So far I haven't found so much. Nietzsche addressed it only shortly, and I think he was very right that when a vigorous nature has not an inclination towards cruelty and is not always preoccupied with itself, it involuntarily strives after gentleness. And this is a distinctive characteristic. So let's see what Anne du Fourmentel is helping us to think. And what I did is made a kind of rigorous listing explaining shortly, because I take the title of a small booklet and started to think, how can we bring gentleness to architecture? And what do I do? While I show the 10 characteristics, what she calls tableaus, that I will always show an image of an architecture or an atlas I am building of a kind of architectural approach, which we find in a lot of contemporary practice, which relates to this notion of gentleness. I won't unpack the projects, but I hope you start to see a relation or are challenged about it. And they not always match to what I say. It can also be the opposite, but I hope it makes clear what the power of gentleness can do. So, they're not always a match, but if you look also back into history, you, like here, Lino Bobardi's museum in Sao Paulo, there is this power of gentleness, this specific kind of aesthetic hospitality. So, 1. Gentleness is not a given. That means that it's cultivated. Although nature can be gentle, gentleness is not natural. 2. We can say that gentleness is the very foundation of ethics. Think of gentleness as the one who's humble, or Gandhi's non-violent resistance, or Mandela's fight overcoming apartheid, or even Gorbachev's perestroika. 3. Gentleness, because of its open, welcoming character, is of multiple political and moral motives. Justice, peace, generosity, listening, dialogue. To make it very clear, gentleness is not violence, war, crime, massacre, genocide, or colonization. 4. Perhaps its greatest enemy, says du Fourmentel, is that the true enemy of gentleness is gentleness, or in other words, fake gentleness. This passivity sold to us via commercial technique or relaxation, or of an overused meaning of comfort, she says. This is a gentleness that does not feel, does not experience, and is another name for indifference, or a sameness disguised as difference. 5. Fake gentleness sells, fits in the grand marketplace of individual well-being that refuses to enter into negativity and confusion and fear as essential human elements, paralyzing the future as well as the present. Here's an image I recently took from The Guardian 2 days ago. There are extreme rich billionaires who now build their own bunkers to live in total privacy and comfort against all risky elements of a live world and a kind of commonwealth. So it's a total isolation in this kind of comfort bubble. And they're doing it. 6, gentleness has its own dialectic, but not one that crushes, but a dialectic that plays all the nuances of the gentle against each other. The private and the commonwealths interact. And 7, with also nuances that can fade all the way to black. For instance, the renunciation of a dying person in a family or with other friends who lets go is a quite brutal act, but it's also a gentleness of being together and the celebration of life. 8, gentleness is a place, a situation of surprise and celebration, an experiential one, impossible to grasp in just descriptions. It's a sensible perception of the mind, a poetics of relation, and of the mind and the senses. 9, gentleness is not exactly kindness. It's not exactly the good. It's not exactly generosity. It's not exactly the state of sugar, sweet either. It's not exactly the quality of velvet, low intensity sound, quiet music, etc., etc. It's all these things simultaneously, a hybrid complexity, or what Rosa Hartman has recently called a being in resonance. Gentleness is a fragile line, a pregnant line of possibility, of dialogue, an openness that comforts us, disturbs us, teaches us, and touches us. Then, as Dufour-Mantell says, her mediations on gentleness are of power, might, strengths occurring in our everyday lives. The French word puissance, because she's French for power, refers to Aristotle's idea of potentiality, the power to change. So the idea of power is not only negative. The power of gentleness is really power which enacts. And it is the power to change or the potential of a possible future by douceur, translated as gentleness in English. Doucement also means to do it slowly, careful or gingerly, or wishing someone a soft landing. So, central to the power of gentleness is its varied and multifaceted connection. Gentleness is not something static, but a potentiality, a power in the becoming, a difference that relates, an inclusivity welcoming the other and otherness. And these moments offer sensory experience while drawing connections between places, ideas, people, and objects. Insightful in relation to gentleness is also what Dufour-Mantell, in another book, In Praise of Risk, is investigating. How is it possible, as living being, to think risk in terms of life rather than death? And it reminds me of what Slavoj Žižek once said: the true measure of love is that you can insult each other. So, risking one's life, being gentle, is for Dufour-Mantell about slightly being out of joint, a radical departure of routine, to disidentify, a chance to make room, the potential of a transformative surprise. The power of gentleness should not give you a deeper understanding what the power of gentleness as mediation can enact. It should give you a deeper meaning. And that we begin to see it where we have never observed it before, and begin to appreciate it as a power when it occurs. And to me, it provides the following insights. To be gentle means that you welcome the unknown within the existing of our reality. Such a place of radical openness is about a margin, a profound edge. Locating oneself there is difficult yet necessary. Such a site of radical possibility concerns a multiplicity of faults and gaps in the fabric of the common experience that change the cartography of the perceptible, the thinkable and the feasible. As such, it allows for new modes of political construction, of common projects, and new possibilities of collective enunciation. Instead of slipping into paternalism or control, the idea of a radical openness is characterized by that it's indeterminate. It's risky, it's a nuance, it's openness, and the multitude of encounters it could generate. To give you a simple example, it's not simple, but I think it makes the argument clear, I hope. Maybe you recognize it, but what you could say that the modern movement with its minimum existence and providing a lot of houses for the people who were not so rich and all the people moving to the cities at the time after the Second World War, high modernism produced housing, minimum existence, and that you can call is a system of care. Very important. It's the politics of care. What I find is very interesting, what Lacaton and Vassal do, and that you could call the power of gentleness, of hospitality, that they renovated cheap, they transformed the existing, but at the same time, a new idea, a new sense of what it means to be human and what it means to live in an apartment. The apartment is no longer a frictionless floor plan, which is most efficient and minimum, but you get a lot of space and undefined spaces, and there you are engaged to find out, but also welcomed to rethink the way you can live in your apartment. So I think Lacaton and Vassal is an example how care and the power of gentleness, in fact, can be seen from one place. There is still care, but something else, a gentleness, a hospitality, an aesthetics of hospitality arrives. And such a methodological radical openness is concerned with what you can call the emergence of the interstitch, the overlap and displacement of domains of difference. And this idea of radical openness, rather than thinking in dialectical opposites, striving for synthesis, is about what Edward Soya has called thirding as othering. And that is about becoming an aesthetics of hospitality that breaks open the conventional way space is thought and used, one that displaces the binary dialectics of colonizer and colonized, the one against the other, by introducing a third that belongs to both the one and the other, opening, here in this case even literally, alternatives, horizons. Such an idea of hybridity or third space is about difference acting upon difference. And this possible third can be enacted through the interstice, as we just saw, or what Deleuze calls and. And once you look between object form itself, something unexpected and unknown emerges what Gilles Deleuze describes as incommensurable, the interval of interstice being incommensurable restores a belief in the becoming as a site where choice has yet to be determined, a reservoir of unthought yet imminent possibilities of modes of existence. And what I like to do, or I'm now starting to work on, is to look back into history and actually what Venturi was working on, and it was only about the form of architecture, but he looked, of course, to complexity and contradiction, and he calls the gentle manifesto. He's not talking so much about the gentle, but his idea of both and, of different styles and different histories coming together, of the popper and the non-popper, etc., I think is a kind of, maybe not the beginning, but is some of the ingredients of what the power of gentleness can do. That I see also in the idea of the interstice and the in-between in the work of Aldo van Eyck, the Dutch architect, but also in the work of Rem Koolhaas. They're all very different, so a rigor needs to be made. Where does it go wrong, where it's interesting. It's not so interesting if where it's go wrong or not, but what kind of experiment and what kind of production of qualities is actually produced in those works. But that is for another time. So, what I was thinking, now that people are driven by the 100 millions already now from their homes by climate disaster, war, political and economical reasons, people not only have to migrate to neighboring countries, but, as we all too well know, to other continents. How we manage this global crisis and how humanly we treat each other as we migrate, that will be key to whether this century of upheavals proceeds emancipatory or with violent conflict. The question how to live and help the ever-growing number of displaced people is one of the decisive issues to address, I think. And I think a politics of care, very important, will tremendously help, but it's not enough. So if civilizations are willing to embrace this trend of migration as a major force to internationalization and act hospitality through a power of gentleness, an idea of cosmopolitization has a chance. It would increase multiple loyalties as well as the increase in diverse transnational forms of life, such as a cosmopolitical imagination. If we really observe her, it has its amazement in the expanding in-between, in which seemingly eternal certainties, borders and differentiations become blurred and effaced. Here we find transcending identity, something we might think in terms of multiplicities. Every individual must orient oneself to find oneself amongst one's multiple personalities with the help of others. And that idea of others can also be abstract ideas of others, memories, stories, symbols, or institutional emblems, or the relation human and non-human. So, in extreme terms, we need to ask ourselves, can difference and sharing, conflict and the general interest be thought together? And this involves two things. On the one hand, situating and relativizing one's own form of life within other horizons of possibility, that of the other. The capacity to see oneself from the perspective of cultural others and to give this practical effect in one's own experience through the exercise of boundary transcending imagination. I believe that such a cosmopolitical outlook, one of hospitality, relying upon the self-realization of individuals to both critically reframe their own openness to the world and willingly enter into a new cosmopolitan sensibility, can be sustained through a power of gentleness, an aesthetics of hospitality. And we as architects, urban planners, can only play a modest but important role in producing those imaginations and those realities. This means that the arrival of the foreigner or the foreign and the chances and changes it brings can in fact on many fronts become a central focus of the discipline of architecture. Polemically, you can say the foreign fuels innovation. Migration should not be feared, on the contrary, be welcomed through mediations of gentleness. So to conclude, through the power of gentleness, an aesthetics of hospitality, as I tried to explain, I hope to have made a case for an open architecture that accommodates and fosters diversity, liveliness, and unpredictability, in stark opposition to overdetermination, exclusion, and colonization. Its gentleness makes freedom productive. It's about a power that is also soft, a nobility that is also humble, a sweetness that is also intelligent, a subtlety that is nevertheless striking. Such a gentleness is precisely about the fragility and complexity that has the potential to subvert and change the status quo. It's a micropolitics of speculative construction towards an open, ecological, and socially just future, toward what several have called a cosmopolitan ethics, where a thirding as othering can appear through the enactment of an aesthetics of hospitality. Thank you very much.
Thank you. There's a short time for questions, comments.
Try to find my glasses. so I can see you better.
Yes, thank you for an excellent presentation. I think it's a hugely timely issue. Just recently read the book by Gaia Vince, a British scientist, who argues that we will have 3 billion people moving toward the poles during this century. And indeed also, as often when talking about huge density, the high-rise comes up as a solution. And also we know this from the modernist time, and I think this is probably not the gentleness, at least what you are talking about. So can you maybe comment a little bit on this? I see also connections to Jan Gehl and David Sim and their soft city approach. So how to find also new planning patterns that can accommodate this kind of density? Thank you.
No, I think it's a very relevant question, or I'm very pleased with your question, because it starts to ask us what kind of aesthetic regime or what kind of aesthetic devices we have available in our profession of architecture. So even what kind of typologies? Is the high rise? Do we still go high? How's the relation between the nature and the artificial, etc., etc.? So for me, it feels that if we take that notion of hospitality serious, or the power of gentleness, it means that we also have to revise or to look again to our architectural language, or the way we mediate content, because we make another definition of how we produce a content, which is a kind of open architecture. So for instance, one researcher I'm now starting to work with is Esra Akan, and she wrote a book, Open Architecture. And what she was doing, she was looking to the IBA projects in Berlin. She made interviews with a lot of refugees, immigrants at the time, coming to Berlin and to live in the IBA projects. And she looks to projects by Krier, by Sisa, Herzberger, Koolhaas, all the architects. In fact, how those typologies and ideas of architecture, what do they actually produce for a migrating culture, or in fact a culture where different people meet and live and work in those housing projects. But to answer you, shall we go high or stay low, the concrete question, I'm not too sure. I think it depends very much on a specific situation where you act. So I think the power of gentleness is not about a manual or a handbook, but depending on the situation, each time you have to see where you can produce this kind of freedom. In the knot of freedom and unfreedom, what can you produce? So one project which was just recently finalized was by MVDV. Perhaps you've seen it. It's called the Valley. It's a high-rise of a lot of apartments standing in a commercial area of only banks and law offices. And they have been able to produce their housing in high-rises, but in the middle it's cut out, and a kind of green park is going through it, which is publicly accessible. So I think that is an interesting exploration to how a building of a lot of apartments, restaurants, museum, etc., how it could become a community in a very difficult area where there are only offices. Now the problem with a lot of skyscrapers, and also in that project, is that the ground floor, how it's connected to the ground, and the idea of the ground is still very, very problematic. But I think in each case, in each project, we have to look again anew if it's wise to make a high-rise at all or not. I think the high-rise by Stefano Boeri and how that becomes a forest, and how it brings insects, and how the trees create the cooling of the building, etc., there are always traces. So I wouldn't say high-rise wrong and low is good. I think it's more complicated.
Thank you. We're going a bit over time, but I need to ask this question. It was very, very gentle presentation about the gentleness, and it very much appears in the materiality. And my question is that what can gentleness be mediated, or what happens to gentleness in the digital? Can gentleness become digital, or what happens to it?
Absolutely. And now I am thinking of a film I saw. I don't know if you've seen it. It is by Steve McQueen, the artist filmmaker, the black artist filmmaker who makes very good films. He made a film which is called Widows, and the opening scene is in Mies van der Rohe's Chicago flats. And now I don't talk about the materiality of the architecture itself or an architecture. I think you can have a tectonics with the power of gentleness, would be another answer. But what was interesting in that image, which you have never seen in a Hollywood blockbuster, the scene opens where a dark-colored woman, she's 51, so she's old. We consider that old in film. It should always be a young, beautiful woman, white, not dark. And she kisses with, she's tongue kissing with a macho guy, a famous movie star, and we never see really a tongue kiss in a Hollywood movie for 20 seconds where people are really in love, really like each other. So on the one hand, it's a kind of discriminating image, because we immediately, if we see as Westerns a black woman, we think she is a prostitute. There's something wrong with the black woman, or that's the image which is being produced. It's immediately racist. And then the guy is seen as a macho guy, he is a hero. So on the first moment you see it, you are caught by the cliches the way you look. But the way they kiss, as it is in real life, because the way it's filmed and the way it's zoomed up, you start to see that the cliches don't work. So what's in your head doesn't fit. So you start to see true love. And that's a kind of true aesthetic devices within film, within image culture, in the way you can narrate the story visually, with sound and what the actors do, and the age of the actors, etc. I would say in that shot, beyond identity, so there's a kind of disidentification happening, you really start to understand, and the scenes go a little bit on, what love can be, what gentleness can produce, going beyond this kind of either-or thinking, like you are black, you're a woman, you're a man, etc., that's thrown apart. And that only works through the aesthetic devices or the aesthetic regime of filmmaking. But it's not just the visual, it's how you tell the story, how you zoom in, who you choose, what is the angle, etc., etc. And that, I think, we have to learn as architects, as filmmakers. And there is a rich culture in film, literature, architecture, which does precisely that. But we have to look carefully, because otherwise we are in Hollywood, you know. And Hollywood films, they always get interesting when the film had a happy end, but then you like to know how are they going to live life that you don't see.
Thank you. That was a beautiful answer. Thank you again, Roemer.
My pleasure.